Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Saidiya Hartman's Venus in Two Acts. I'm really excited about this module in particular because in this module we're going to focus on historiographical problems in women, gender, sexuality studies. So our first part of the module, we're doing what we're doing today, which is Saidiya Hartman's Venus in Two Acts. I've titled this video Hartman on the Violence of the Archive. And next week, we're going to talk about really interesting historiographical questions in queer and trans studies. So to begin with, what is historiography, right? That's sort of a big $2 word that I've been saying for a little bit, right? And really, historiography describes the field of inquiry and questions that are associated with writing history, right? So graphy, writing, history, right? Writing history. How do we write history? And in particular, it focuses on problems oftentimes related to what historians will call the corpus, that their work is based on. So what kind of historical materials are you looking at, right? What are questions say about those? You might also have questions about technique that you bring to whatever it is that you end up reading, right? So maybe you select a bunch of court documents or whatever, right? But now the question is, what are you going to get out of it, right? How are you going to read the material in order to produce some new retelling of the history? And then finally, you can have questions about method, right? Questions about how do we pull all of those techniques together to form a single cohesive narrative about the material that you're writing about. So on this number one I have here on the left side of the board, I point out that history is kind of two things at once, which is really fascinating. History is, on the one hand, the historical events from the past that we call history. So the Civil War is history, right? Transatlantic slavery is history. These are critical aspects of American histories, the actual bona fide historical events as they occurred. But the other side of what history is it's the recordings of those events. It's how we choose to tell that story, right? So, for example, you can write two very different histories of American colonialism by describing it perhaps on the one hand as the inevitable plan of God or something like that, right? Sort of manifest destiny reading of the colonization of the Americas, right? That views essentially the colonization of the United States as inevitable and as say the success of culture over barbarism, right? This is how American colonists often understood themselves. Hopefully the violence of that narrative of events, right, is foregrounded in the description. But you might also take, obviously, a more critical lens towards the colonization of the Americas, right? Some witnesses of colonization wrote about how brutal it was, right? And you could write, a totally different way of rendering those historical events. So history is both about the events that we're interpreting, but also how it is that we are deciding to interpret them, right? What are we, as the current historians, the people writing in the present, how are we using that history? What is that history doing for us such that we're interested enough to want to write a history about it? In Venus in Two Acts is really an article about Saidiya Hartman, who is this really eminent historian, but also, as we're going to see, fiction writer, who is looking to write about the intimate lives of slave women. And really what this article, I think, is about the fundamental problem with trying to write a history like that, right? Namely, that there's this thing that we're going to call the archive, which is something like the sum total available statements that we can make about a given period, right? And we're going to clarify that in a little bit further, right? But to start out with, Hartman begins the piece by saying that Venus, who is, as of yet, largely unexplained, right? But this was a sort of like common pet name for black women, often given to them by white men, right? So Hartman wants to write in a sort of autobiographical register about the internal lives of slave women. And as a historian, she turns to the available historical evidence about black women, right? The recorded, the recorded scripts, writings, sorry, I don't know why it took me so long to come up with that, writings that can tell her about this story, right? They can allow her to write not just like a story about, black women during slavery, but even a history and indeed an interior and autobiographical history. However, the problem is this, that when Hartman turns to the historical material that is available to her to describe Venus, she sees Venus described as a victim, namely of the murder during the Middle Passage of the ship captain, along with another black girl that she was apparently clutching. So Venus appears in legal proceedings, namely as a victim, and especially in the document that Hartman is really inspired by. The captain gets off for murdering Venus and her friend, right? And so Venus appears as a victim in court proceedings, right? Just very, very briefly, like only a single sentence really about Venus. She appears as debris in a captain's log, right? I mean, one thing that would happen in the Middle Passage is sometimes ships would throw slaves overboard, either because they're low on food or for weight-related reasons or something like that, right? So there would often be recordings of the slaves that were thrown overboard and treated as, a commodity that had, unfortunately lost its value and become debris. Black women are described as prostitutes and as sexual objects for the ship crew, and that is it, right? So Hartman was looking to try to clarify the story of this black woman who appears in these court proceedings and looks and looks and looks and tries to find everything that there is about Venus in order to write a story about her. And this is how Venus appears, right? As sexual object, prostitute, as inhuman debris, and as a victim, a life that was not even worth grieving, or a life that legally counted for anything. And Hartman's central point is that Venus is all black women, right? So Venus is sort of like a pet name. It's not like a real legal name, or, what even is something like a legal name and something like the Middle Passage, right? Who knows? But Hartman's point is that the situation that we're facing when we try to write a story about this particular woman or girl in the Middle Passage is actually the story of every black woman from the middle passage, right? I'm actually going to skip over to number 2 on the right side of the board here, right? This is a quote from early on in the article. She says, quote, "There is not one extant autobiographical narrative of a female captive who survived the middle passage." Not one. So what that means is that we essentially see Venus only on the condition that she is interacting with systems of power, right? Either the sexual fantasies of the ship crew, of court proceedings and legal documents, of an accounting of commodities, etc., right? But nothing that could ever speak to the intimate and interior life of Venus, right? Which is, of course, every woman on the middle passage, right? We see only really, Hartman here quotes Michel Foucault, who is very important to her for writing about these historiographical questions, is that our knowledge of Black women's history is constrained to, quote, little more than a register of her encounter with power. And so let's move on to this quote on the right side, number 1, right? Since we already did number 2. What else is there to know? Hers is the fate is the same fate as every other Black Venus. No one remembered her name or recorded the things she said or observed that she refused to say anything at all. So we think about the archive, right? I've titled this "The Violence of the Archive," and that's one of the central concepts in this work. The archive is a Foucauldian concept, and it's meant to refer to the structure of all the things that are statable at a given point in time. That sounds very, very vague, right? But let's zero in on what this means. So think about the requirements for writing history, right? So in order to write history, you have to record events, and they have to be based on some degree of evidence that they actually took place, right? That's what makes something a history versus, it being a novel or something like that, right? So in other words, the corpus, the sum total of what we can say about Black women historically is limited by the archive itself, right? In other words, there's a structure to things that we can say historically about Black women, and that structure is the structure of slavery, right? Our Hartman central point is that the archive of slavery, the things that we can say historically about slavery, is conditioned by the existence of slavery itself, right? So what I mean by that is just that slavery was a social and economic institution that required enormous amounts of ideological justification, right? So in other words, it's not just that these events occurred, but that everyone at the time understood them as natural and inevitable, right? That this was seen as a sort of civilizing process, right? And so Black women were recorded in histories in these racist ways, and namely as sort of objects, right? To be manipulated, sculpted, etc. by white colonists, right? So Hartman's point is that the archive of slavery, the structure of things that are sayable, is itself a reflection of the political institution of slavery and colonization and racism, right? And we can move over to our quote number 3 on this right side of the board, right? Here she says, the irreparable violence of the Atlantic slave trade resides precisely in all of the stories that we cannot know and that will never be recovered. So Hartman is then faced with this dilemma, like, what do you do as a historian, right? If you're limited to writing, if stories can only be constructed from the evidence that we have available, and all of that evidence reflects the founding violence of slavery and colonization, how do you write a history of black women that is genuinely emancipatory, right? That is freeing, right? If you're a historian of black women during slavery or during the Middle Passage, you presumably are interested in writing these histories exactly because you see it as important to a certain kind of freedom struggle, right? The unfreedom of black women is exactly that they are reduced to being mere objects by the historical society that they are now a part of, right? And so how is there any way to think about, to write about, to have stories about slavery that can be genuinely emancipatory, that can be genuinely freeing, that has an eye towards liberation? In other words, how do we tell impossible stories, right? Stories that, according to the structure of what we have, are not sayable, right? And this is not just a totally contingent thing, right? We have none of the interior lives, autographical material about black women during the Middle Passage. So it is now impossible to write a history or a story, a historical narrative of the interior lives of a black woman during the Middle Passage. So what is Hartman's conclusion? Well, Hartman says we're going to tell these stories even if it is, strictly speaking, outside of the archive of history, right? So Hartman, tells this story, a story that she imagines for Venus, that would be impossible to tell, that would be impossible to appear in the archival material that is available to her. And importantly, the archive is not like a place, right? So like if you go to UNM, right, like we have archives, we have like a location where there's documented historical evidence of things that took place. But Foucault and Hartman don't mean archive in this very limited particular way. They mean archive as not just the historical evidence at UNM or at some other university or whatever, but the sum total of the evidence that is available, the sum total of the things that are recorded. And so Hartman's move is to move outside of the bounds of the archive, to move beyond even history itself into a method that she calls critical fabulation. So she now has no claim to writing, strictly speaking, historical stories, right? She has books where she writes, and some of them are strictly historical. They're documentation and analysis of laws, practices, etc. that existed during American slavery or in the Middle Passage, institutions related to American slavery. But she also has books that involve this critical fabulation method, where because there is nothing to write about in terms of writing an autobiographical or interior or internal narrative of Venus or any other black women during the period, that she tells a story about what could have been, right? What maybe peeks through the lines of the ordinary stories that we have to say about the period. The stories that we can no longer tell as history, but perhaps could have been historical. So I hope that you found this question interesting. I really love this article. I think that the questions it raises are super duper fascinating. And I look forward to what you think in the discussion forum. Bye.